Question 1. The assessment process reveals that a client of API Group, who has a moderate risk tolerance and a short-term investment horizon, has expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid private equity fund. The representative has reviewed the client's profile and believes this investment is not suitable. What is the most appropriate course of action for the API Group representative? Option A. Recommend a different, equally speculative investment that the representative believes the client might be more receptive to. Option B. Clearly explain to the client why the investment is not suitable based on their risk tolerance and investment horizon, provide educational resources on the risks involved, and then propose alternative suitable investments that align with their profile. Option C. Refuse the client's request outright without further explanation or offering alternatives. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their instructions are paramount. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their instructions are paramount. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in financial advisory, balancing client needs with regulatory compliance when a client expresses interest in an investment that may not be suitable. API Group, operating within the U.S. regulatory framework, must ensure its representatives adhere strictly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, rules. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the representative to navigate a delicate situation where a client's stated desire conflicts with their best interests and regulatory mandates. The representative must uphold their fiduciary duty and suitability obligations without alienating the client or appearing dismissive. The correct approach involves a thorough suitability assessment, followed by a clear, educational explanation to the client about why the requested investment may not be appropriate, and then offering suitable alternatives. This aligns with SEC Rule 15C3-1 and FINRA Rule 2111, which mandate that firms and their associated persons have a reasonable basis to believe a recommended security is suitable for a customer based on their investment profile. This includes considering factors like financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and experience. The representative's duty is to act in the client's best interest, which may mean advising against a particular investment even if the client requests it. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without a proper suitability assessment. This directly violates FINRA Rule 2111 and SEC regulations, as it bypasses the crucial step of ensuring the investment aligns with the client's profile. Another incorrect approach is to simply refuse the client's request without providing a clear, reasoned explanation and offering alternatives. While the refusal might be justified by suitability concerns, the lack of education and alternative suggestions fails to meet the standard of professional service and client relationship management expected under regulatory guidelines. It can lead to client dissatisfaction and a perception of poor service, potentially impacting the firm's reputation and compliance standing. A third incorrect approach is to push a different, potentially equally unsuitable, product to appease the client. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a failure to uphold the core principles of suitability and fiduciary responsibility. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client well-being and regulatory adherence. This involves 1. Actively listening to the client's request and understanding their motivations. 2. Conducting a comprehensive suitability assessment based on the client's established profile. 3. If the requested investment is unsuitable, clearly and respectfully explaining the reasons, referencing relevant risk factors and how they conflict with the client's profile. 4. Proactively offering alternative investments that are genuinely suitable and align with the client's objectives. 5. Documenting all conversations and decisions thoroughly. Question 2. The investigation demonstrates that API Group's current inventory management system is experiencing significant delays, impacting production timelines. A proposed process optimization aims to streamline this by implementing a new automated tracking system. Which of the following approaches best balances efficiency gains with regulatory and ethical considerations for API Group? Option A. Prioritize the fastest implementation of the new system, even if it means temporarily suspending certain internal audit procedures to expedite the rollout. Option B. Focus the optimization solely on reducing the number of personnel involved in inventory management to cut costs, without a detailed evaluation of the new system's operational or regulatory impact. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the proposed automated tracking system, including a thorough assessment of its compliance with all relevant industry regulations and data privacy laws, and consult with API Group's legal and compliance teams before deployment. Option D. Immediately deploy the new automated tracking system to resolve the delays, with a plan to address any compliance issues that arise post-implementation. The correct answer is D. Immediately deploy the new automated tracking system to resolve the delays, with a plan to address any compliance issues that arise post-implementation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because API Group, as a publicly traded entity, is subject to stringent regulatory oversight and ethical standards designed to ensure fair and transparent operations. The pressure to optimize processes can sometimes lead to shortcuts or decisions that, while appearing efficient in the short term, may inadvertently violate regulatory requirements or ethical principles. Careful judgment is required to balance operational efficiency with compliance and integrity. The correct approach involves a thorough review of existing processes, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies, and then proposing and implementing changes that are compliant with all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines. This includes consulting with legal and compliance departments to ensure proposed optimizations do not contravene any laws or internal policies. This approach is right because it prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct, which are fundamental to maintaining API Group's reputation, investor confidence, and legal standing. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the duty of care owed to stakeholders, as often mandated by securities regulations and industry best practices. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering regulatory implications would fail to uphold API Group's legal obligations. For instance, implementing a new process that inadvertently leads to non-compliance with data privacy laws or environmental regulations would expose the company to significant fines, legal action, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thorough risk assessment could overlook potential ethical breaches. This might involve pressuring employees to meet unrealistic deadlines, leading to burnout or a disregard for established safety protocols, which could violate labor laws and ethical employment practices. A third incorrect approach that involves bypassing established internal controls or approval processes in the name of efficiency is also professionally unacceptable. This undermines the integrity of API Group's governance framework and could mask more serious issues, potentially violating internal audit requirements and principles of accountability. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the objective, process optimization, then systematically evaluates potential solutions against a backdrop of regulatory requirements, ethical considerations, and internal policies. This involves proactive consultation with relevant departments, legal, compliance, HR, operations, conducting thorough risk assessments, and prioritizing solutions that offer sustainable improvements without compromising integrity or compliance. Question 3. The analysis reveals that API Group is implementing a new automated screening tool for its hiring process. To ensure compliance with the API Group hiring assessment tests regulatory framework, which of the following approaches to risk assessment for this new tool is most appropriate? Option A. Focus solely on the speed and efficiency gains the tool offers, deferring any detailed risk assessment until a potential issue arises. Option B. Rely on the vendor's assurances that the tool is compliant and has undergone internal testing, without conducting an independent risk assessment. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive, documented risk assessment that identifies potential biases in the algorithm, data privacy concerns, and the impact of any system failures, and develop specific mitigation strategies for each identified risk. Option D. Perform a brief, informal review of the tool's features to ensure it meets basic functional requirements, assuming no significant risks beyond standard IT security. Correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive, documented risk assessment that identifies potential biases in the algorithm, data privacy concerns, and the impact of any system failures, and develop specific mitigation strategies for each identified risk. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires API Group to balance the need for efficient operations with the imperative to comply with stringent regulatory requirements, specifically those pertaining to risk assessment and reporting under the API Group Hiring Assessment Test Framework. Misinterpreting or inadequately applying risk assessment principles can lead to significant compliance failures, reputational damage, and potential legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all identified risks are appropriately categorized, mitigated, and reported in a manner that aligns with the established regulatory standards. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process of identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risks associated with the hiring process. This includes considering the likelihood and impact of potential risks, and then developing and implementing appropriate control measures. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the core principles of risk management mandated by the API Group Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework. This framework emphasizes proactive identification and mitigation of risks to ensure fair and compliant hiring practices. By thoroughly assessing risks, API Group can demonstrate due diligence and adherence to regulatory expectations, thereby safeguarding its operations and reputation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate operational efficiency without a corresponding risk assessment fails to meet regulatory obligations. This approach is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it prioritizes speed over compliance, potentially overlooking critical risks that could lead to discriminatory hiring, data breaches, or other violations. Another incorrect approach that involves a superficial or ad hoc risk assessment, where risks are identified but not adequately analyzed or mitigated, is also unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to robust risk management and can result in unaddressed vulnerabilities, exposing API Group to significant compliance failures and potential penalties. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal judgment rather than a structured, data-driven risk assessment process is problematic. This is because it lacks the objectivity and thoroughness required by regulatory standards, making it difficult to defend the assessment and mitigation strategies if challenged. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory requirements. This involves consulting the API Group Hiring Assessment Test Guidelines to identify specific mandates for risk assessment. Subsequently, a structured risk assessment methodology should be applied, ensuring all potential risks are identified, analyzed for likelihood and impact, and prioritized. Control measures should then be developed and documented, with clear responsibilities assigned for their implementation and monitoring. Regular review and updates to the risk assessment process are crucial to adapt to changing circumstances and maintain compliance. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows that API Group is undertaking a comprehensive review of its risk management framework. Which of the following approaches to risk assessment best aligns with regulatory expectations for a publicly traded company like API Group, ensuring both robust oversight and efficient resource allocation? Option A. An ad hoc assessment driven by immediate operational concerns, with a primary focus on risks that have already materialized. Option B. A qualitative assessment that considers only risks with a very high probability of occurrence, regardless of their potential impact. Option C. A review focused exclusively on historical financial data to identify past anomalies and potential areas of fraud. Option D. A systematic process that identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, with findings integrated into strategic planning and financial reporting. The correct answer is D. A systematic process that identifies, analyzes, and prioritizes risks based on their potential impact and likelihood, with findings integrated into strategic planning and financial reporting. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group, as a publicly traded entity, is subject to stringent regulatory oversight concerning its financial reporting and risk management practices. The challenge lies in balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and resources, while ensuring compliance with relevant regulations. A failure to adequately identify and assess risks could lead to misstatements in financial reports, regulatory penalties, and damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to prioritize risks and allocate resources effectively. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process that integrates risk assessment into the overall business strategy and financial reporting framework. This approach ensures that potential threats to API Group's objectives, including financial stability and regulatory compliance, are identified, analyzed, and addressed proactively. This aligns with the principles of sound corporate governance and the requirements of regulatory bodies that mandate robust internal controls and risk management systems. By focusing on the likelihood and impact of identified risks, API Group can make informed decisions about mitigation strategies, thereby safeguarding its assets and ensuring the integrity of its financial information. An approach that relies solely on historical financial data without considering emerging operational or market risks is professionally unacceptable because it fails to provide a forward-looking perspective. Regulatory frameworks often require an assessment of risks that could impact future financial performance, not just past events. Similarly, an approach that prioritizes only high-impact risks while ignoring those with a lower but still significant probability of occurrence is flawed. Effective risk management requires a balanced consideration of both likelihood and impact to prevent a cascade of smaller issues from becoming a systemic problem. Furthermore, an approach that lacks clear documentation and a defined methodology for risk assessment can lead to inconsistencies, a lack of accountability, and an inability to demonstrate compliance to auditors or regulators. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding API Group's strategic objectives and the regulatory environment in which it operates. This understanding should then inform the identification of potential risks that could impede the achievement of these objectives. Structured risk assessment process, which includes evaluating the likelihood and potential impact of each identified risk, should be followed. This evaluation should be documented thoroughly. Based on the assessment, appropriate mitigation strategies should be developed and implemented, with ongoing monitoring and review to ensure their effectiveness. This iterative process ensures that risk management remains dynamic and responsive to changing internal and external conditions. Question 5. To address the challenge of potential conflicts of interest arising from a new operational process at API Group, which of the following represents the most professionally sound and compliant approach to ensure ethical conduct and regulatory adherence? Option A. Focus on investigating and disciplining employees only if a conflict of interest is discovered after it has occurred, without implementing proactive measures to prevent such occurrences. Option B. Assume that employees will inherently act in the best interest of API Group and avoid conflicts of interest without the need for specific new guidelines related to the process. Option C. Implement a comprehensive written policy that clearly defines prohibited actions, mandates disclosure of potential conflicts, and requires pre-approval for any activities that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. Coupled with regular employee training on this policy. Option D. Rely on informal verbal instructions from supervisors to employees regarding the ethical implications of the new process, trusting that employees will understand and adhere to the company's general ethical standards. Correct answer is C. Implement a comprehensive written policy that clearly defines prohibited actions, mandates disclosure of potential conflicts, and requires pre-approval for any activities that could be perceived as a conflict of interest, coupled with regular employee training on this policy. Explanation. Scenario analysis. API Group is facing a situation where a new operational process, intended to streamline service delivery, has inadvertently created a potential conflict of interest for certain employees. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the company's drive for efficiency with its obligation to uphold regulatory compliance and ethical standards. Employees might be tempted to prioritize the new process for personal gain or to avoid perceived administrative burdens, potentially leading to breaches of conduct. Careful judgment is required to ensure that process optimization does not compromise integrity or regulatory adherence. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves establishing a clear, documented policy that explicitly prohibits employees from using their position or knowledge of the new process to gain personal advantage or to steer business towards affiliated entities without proper disclosure and approval. This aligns with the principles of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, which mandate transparency and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. By requiring disclosure and seeking pre-approval for any potential conflicts, API Group ensures that all business dealings are conducted with integrity and in accordance with applicable laws and internal codes of conduct. This proactive stance prevents potential misconduct and safeguards the company's reputation. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies solely on informal verbal guidance from management is professionally unacceptable because it lacks the necessary documentation and accountability. This can lead to misunderstandings, inconsistent application of rules, and difficulty in proving compliance if an issue arises. It fails to provide a clear, accessible reference for employees and leaves the company vulnerable to regulatory scrutiny. An approach that assumes employees will naturally act ethically without explicit guidelines is also professionally flawed. While many employees are ethical, relying on assumption rather than policy creates a significant risk. It fails to address the specific challenges posed by the new process and does not provide a framework for identifying or managing potential conflicts of interest, which is a common regulatory expectation. An approach that focuses only on punishing misconduct after it occurs, without implementing preventative measures, is reactive and insufficient. While disciplinary action is a component of compliance, it does not address the root cause of potential conflicts of interest arising from process changes. It also fails to foster a culture of proactive ethical behavior and compliance, which is a key objective for responsible organizations. Professional reasoning. Professionals at API Group should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. This involves identifying potential ethical and regulatory risks associated with new processes, developing clear policies and procedures to mitigate these risks, providing comprehensive training to employees, and establishing mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and enforcement. The focus should always be on prevention, transparency, and accountability, ensuring that business objectives are pursued within a robust ethical and regulatory framework. Question 6. The review process indicates that API Group's internal operational workflows are experiencing inefficiencies. Considering the need for process optimization, which of the following approaches would best align with regulatory expectations and professional best practices for a US-based company? Option A. Implement a new cutting-edge software solution immediately to automate tasks, without prior pilot testing or integration planning. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive analysis of current workflows to identify bottlenecks, implement standardized procedures supported by appropriate technology, and ensure ongoing personnel training on updated processes and regulatory compliance. Option C. Prioritize rapid deployment of new procedures by bypassing detailed impact assessments and extensive employee training to achieve quick efficiency gains. Option D. Reduce operational costs by eliminating non-essential quality control checks within the review process to expedite turnaround times. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive analysis of current workflows to identify bottlenecks, implement standardized procedures supported by appropriate technology, and ensure ongoing personnel training on updated processes and regulatory compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group is seeking to optimize its internal review processes, which directly impacts efficiency, compliance, and potentially client satisfaction. The challenge lies in identifying an approach that not only streamlines operations, but also adheres strictly to the regulatory framework governing API Group's operations, which for this assessment is assumed to be the U.S. regulatory environment. A failure to align process optimization with regulatory requirements could lead to compliance breaches, operational inefficiencies, and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of existing workflows to identify bottlenecks and redundancies, followed by the implementation of standardized, technology-enabled solutions that enhance data integrity and auditability, all while ensuring continuous training for personnel on updated procedures. This is the most professionally sound method because it directly addresses process optimization by focusing on tangible improvements like standardization and technology adoption, which are often encouraged by regulatory bodies to ensure accuracy and reduce errors. Furthermore, the emphasis on continuous training ensures that personnel remain compliant with evolving regulations and best practices, thereby mitigating risks. This approach aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and operational excellence, which are implicitly or explicitly supported by U.S. financial and operational regulations that prioritize accuracy, transparency, and accountability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction by eliminating quality control checks would be professionally unacceptable. This is because such a move directly contravenes regulatory mandates that require robust internal controls and due diligence to prevent fraud, errors, and noncompliance. Eliminating checks increases the risk of undetected issues, leading to potential violations of regulations, such as those enforced by the SEC or other relevant U.S. authorities. Another incorrect approach, which involves adopting new software without adequate testing or integration planning, is also professionally unsound. This can lead to data corruption, system failures, and operational disruptions, all of which can have significant compliance implications. Regulators expect organizations to implement systems that are reliable and secure, and a hasty, unvetted adoption process demonstrates a lack of due diligence and risk management, potentially violating data protection and operational integrity standards. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thoroughness, such as rushing through the optimization without proper stakeholder consultation or impact assessment, is flawed. This can lead to resistance from employees, unforeseen operational disruptions, and the implementation of solutions that do not fully meet the needs of the business or regulatory requirements. Professional decision-making in process optimization requires a balanced consideration of efficiency gains, risk mitigation, regulatory adherence, and stakeholder buy-in, employing a structured methodology that prioritizes accuracy, compliance, and sustainability. Question 7. What factors determine whether an API group employee's personal investment decision, based on information received from a trusted industry contact, could be construed as a violation of insider trading regulations? Option A. The employee's tenure at API Group and their level of seniority within the organization. Option B. The perceived trustworthiness of the industry contact and the employee's past investment success. Option C. The employee's personal financial situation and the potential for profit from the investment. Option D. The materiality and non-public nature of the information received from the industry contact and whether it has been properly vetted by API Group's compliance department. The correct answer is D. The materiality and non-public nature of the information received from the industry contact, and whether it has been properly vetted by API Group's compliance department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an API Group employee because it requires navigating potential conflicts of interest and ensuring compliance with internal policies and external regulations designed to maintain market integrity and prevent insider trading. The employee must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between legitimate information gathering and the misuse of material non-public information. The correct approach involves seeking clarification from API Group's compliance department or legal counsel. This is the most appropriate professional response because it directly addresses the ambiguity of the situation by engaging the designated internal authorities responsible for interpreting and enforcing regulatory requirements and company policies. This proactive step ensures that the employee acts in accordance with API Group's established compliance framework and relevant securities laws, thereby mitigating the risk of regulatory violations or ethical breaches. It demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and adherence to the highest standards of professional conduct expected by API Group and its stakeholders. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the investment based on the information without seeking further guidance. This fails to acknowledge the potential for the information to be material and non-public, thereby risking a violation of insider trading regulations. Such a failure could lead to severe penalties for the individual and reputational damage for API Group. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the information with colleagues outside of the compliance department before making a decision. This could inadvertently lead to the dissemination of potentially material non-public information, creating a wider risk of insider trading violations and breaching confidentiality obligations. A further incorrect approach would be to dismiss the information as irrelevant without proper assessment. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to appreciate the nuances of securities regulations, which can deem even seemingly minor pieces of information as material when aggregated or in specific contexts. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes seeking expert advice when faced with uncertainty regarding regulatory compliance or ethical considerations. This involves identifying potential risks, understanding the relevant regulatory landscape, consulting internal policies and procedures, and crucially, engaging with compliance or legal departments to obtain definitive guidance before taking any action that could have regulatory or ethical implications. Question 8. Process analysis reveals that API Group's stock price has been under pressure due to market concerns about its future earnings. A senior executive suggests that the company should consider accelerating the recognition of certain long-term service contracts and reclassifying some operational expenses as extraordinary items to present a more favorable earnings per share for the upcoming quarter, thereby potentially boosting the stock price and the value of their stock options. Considering the regulatory framework for publicly traded companies in the U.S., which of the following approaches best aligns with professional and ethical obligations? Option A. Focus solely on communicating positive future outlooks and strategic initiatives to the market, while making minor, justifiable adjustments to financial reporting to align with investor expectations. Option B. Strictly adhere to generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, and relevant SEC guidance for revenue recognition and expense classification, ensuring all financial reporting accurately reflects the economic substance of API Group's operations, regardless of short-term market pressures. Option C. Implement the suggested accounting adjustments to present a more favorable earnings per share, arguing that these are permissible interpretations of accounting rules designed to reflect the company's underlying value. Option D. Consult with external auditors to find the most aggressive, yet technically compliant, accounting methods to maximize reported earnings for the current quarter. Correct answer is B. Strictly adhere to generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, and relevant SEC guidance for revenue recognition and expense classification, ensuring all financial reporting accurately reflects the economic substance of API Group's operations, regardless of short-term market pressures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group, as a publicly traded entity, is subject to stringent regulatory oversight concerning its financial reporting and disclosures. The pressure to meet market expectations, coupled with the potential for personal gain through stock options, creates a conflict of interest and a temptation to manipulate financial data. Careful judgment is required to uphold ethical standards and regulatory compliance, ensuring that API Group's financial statements are accurate and transparent. The correct approach involves a commitment to the highest ethical standards and strict adherence to regulatory frameworks governing financial reporting. This means ensuring all financial information presented by API Group is accurate, complete, and reflects the true economic substance of transactions. It requires proactive engagement with internal controls, open communication with auditors, and a willingness to challenge any practices that could lead to misrepresentation. This approach is justified by regulations such as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act (SOX) in the U.S., which mandates robust internal controls over financial reporting and imposes severe penalties for fraud and misrepresentation. Ethical codes of conduct for financial professionals also emphasize integrity, objectivity, and professional competence, all of which are violated by any attempt to artificially inflate earnings. An incorrect approach that involves selectively presenting positive information while downplaying negative trends would be a failure to comply with disclosure requirements. This misleads investors and the market, violating principles of fairness and transparency. It could also be construed as a violation of securities laws, such as Rule 10b-5 under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which prohibits manipulative or deceptive devices in connection with the purchase or sale of securities. Another incorrect approach, such as accelerating revenue recognition for services not yet fully rendered or prematurely booking anticipated future sales, constitutes accounting manipulation. This directly violates generally accepted accounting principles (GAAP) and SOX requirements for accurate financial reporting. Such actions can lead to restatements of financial results, significant fines, and reputational damage for API Group and its leadership. The professional decision-making framework for situations like this should involve a multi-step process. First, identify the ethical and regulatory implications of any proposed action. Second, consult relevant internal policies and external regulations. Third, seek advice from legal counsel or compliance officers if there is any ambiguity. Fourth, Prioritize transparency and accuracy in all financial communications. Finally, be prepared to act with integrity, even if it means resisting pressure to engage in questionable practices, understanding that long-term trust and sustainability are paramount for API Group. Question 9. Risk assessment procedures indicate that API Group is considering a new software solution to streamline its internal reporting processes. Which of the following implementation strategies best ensures adherence to the regulatory framework governing financial institutions? Option A. Prioritize the software solution that offers the most significant cost savings and fastest implementation timeline, assuming the vendor's general compliance statements are sufficient. Option B. Select the software solution that has the broadest feature set and is most technologically advanced, with the understanding that compliance adjustments can be made post-implementation. Option C. Opt for the software solution recommended by a majority of industry peers, without conducting an independent assessment of its specific compliance features relevant to API Group's operations. Option D. Engage API Group's compliance and legal departments to conduct a detailed review of the software's capabilities against specific regulatory requirements, including data handling, privacy, and reporting functionalities, before making a selection. The correct answer is A. Prioritize the software solution that offers the most significant cost savings and fastest implementation timeline, assuming the vendor's general compliance statements are sufficient. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group, as a regulated entity, must navigate the complexities of implementing new compliance software while ensuring that the chosen solution not only meets operational needs, but also adheres strictly to the relevant regulatory framework. The challenge lies in balancing efficiency gains with the absolute requirement of regulatory compliance, particularly concerning data handling and reporting. A failure to do so could result in significant penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruption. The correct approach involves a thorough, multifaceted evaluation that prioritizes regulatory alignment. This means actively engaging compliance officers and legal counsel to scrutinize the software's capabilities against specific regulatory mandates, such as those governing data privacy, transaction reporting, and record keeping. The justification for this approach is rooted in the principle of regulatory adherence, which is paramount in the financial services industry. By ensuring the software is designed to meet or exceed these requirements from the outset, API Group mitigates the risk of non-compliance and avoids costly retrofitting or remediation efforts. This proactive stance is ethically sound and legally defensible. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without adequate regulatory due diligence is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from prioritizing financial expediency over legal and ethical obligations, potentially exposing API Group to significant fines and sanctions for noncompliance. Another incorrect approach, which relies on vendor assurances without independent verification of regulatory compliance, is also flawed. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an abdication of responsibility. As API Group cannot delegate its compliance obligations to a third party, the regulatory framework places the onus of compliance squarely on the firm itself. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all applicable regulatory requirements. This is followed by a comprehensive assessment of potential solutions against these requirements, involving all relevant internal stakeholders: compliance, legal, IT, operations. A risk-based approach should then be applied, prioritizing solutions that offer the highest degree of regulatory certainty and the lowest risk of non-compliance. Finally, ongoing monitoring and periodic reassessment of the chosen solution's compliance effectiveness are crucial. Question 10. Operational review demonstrates that API Group is experiencing a significant, unforeseen decline in a key market segment, which is likely to impact quarterly earnings below analyst expectations. The investor relations team is concerned about the immediate market reaction and is considering several strategies to manage the communication. Which approach best balances regulatory compliance with stakeholder interests? Option A. Immediately issue a press release detailing the market segment decline and its projected impact on earnings, while also providing context and outlining API Group's strategic response. Option B. Inform key institutional investors and analysts privately about the situation to prepare them for the upcoming earnings report. Option C. Focus the public announcement on positive aspects of other business segments to offset the negative news about the declining market. Option D. Delay the announcement until the end of the quarter to allow for further analysis and to potentially mitigate the negative impact through operational adjustments. The correct answer is A. Immediately issue a press release detailing the market segment decline and its projected impact on earnings, while also providing context and outlining API Group's strategic response. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group, as a publicly traded entity, operates under stringent regulatory oversight, particularly concerning financial reporting and investor communications. The pressure to meet market expectations, coupled with the potential for significant financial implications, creates a complex decision-making environment. Navigating this requires a robust understanding of ethical obligations and regulatory compliance to ensure transparency and maintain stakeholder trust. The correct approach involves prioritizing accurate and timely disclosure of material information to the market, even if it presents a short-term negative outlook. This aligns with the fundamental principles of securities regulation, such as those enforced by the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, in the United States, which mandate fair disclosure and prohibit selective disclosure of material non-public information. By adhering to these principles, API Group upholds its legal and ethical duty to all investors, preventing insider trading and maintaining market integrity. This approach fosters long-term confidence and stability. An incorrect approach that involves withholding negative information to manage market perception would be a direct violation of disclosure requirements. This could lead to accusations of market manipulation and securities fraud, resulting in severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as selectively disclosing the negative information to a select group of analysts or investors, constitutes selective disclosure, which is strictly prohibited and undermines the principle of equal access to information for all market participants. This practice can lead to unfair trading advantages and erode investor confidence. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on short-term stock price performance without considering the long-term implications of disclosure failures would be ethically unsound and legally risky, as it prioritizes immediate gains over sustained compliance and stakeholder well-being. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and its potential impact. This should be followed by a thorough review of relevant regulations and internal policies. Seeking guidance from legal and compliance departments is crucial. The decision should then be evaluated against ethical principles, prioritizing transparency, fairness, and accuracy. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale behind the chosen course of action is also a critical step in demonstrating due diligence and accountability. Question 11. The audit findings indicate that certain operational workflows within API Group are exhibiting inefficiencies, leading to increased costs and potential delays. Management is considering several strategies to optimize these processes. Which of the following strategies best balances the need for efficiency with the imperative to maintain regulatory compliance and ethical standards? Option A. Conducting a thorough review of existing workflows to identify redundancies and inefficiencies, followed by a redesign that integrates regulatory requirements and ethical considerations from the outset. Option B. Outsourcing the process optimization initiative to a third-party vendor with a mandate to achieve significant cost savings, with minimal oversight from API Group's internal compliance team. Option C. Focusing solely on automating the current inefficient processes without a comprehensive reevaluation of their underlying logic or regulatory adherence. Option D. Implementing a streamlined process that prioritizes speed and cost reduction, with a post-implementation review to identify any compliance issues. The correct answer is D. Implementing a streamlined process that prioritizes speed and cost reduction, with a post-implementation review to identify any compliance issues. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficiency and cost reduction with the imperative to maintain robust compliance and ethical standards, particularly within the context of API Group's operations. The audit findings highlight a potential disconnect between operational goals and regulatory adherence, demanding a nuanced approach that prioritizes long-term integrity over short-term gains. Careful judgment is required to identify solutions that are both effective and compliant. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review and redesign of existing processes, focusing on identifying and eliminating redundancies and inefficiencies, while ensuring that all new or modified processes strictly adhere to relevant regulations and API Group's internal policies. This approach is correct because it proactively addresses the root causes of the audit findings by embedding compliance and ethical considerations into the process design itself. It demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement and risk mitigation, aligning with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory expectations for companies like API Group. This method ensures that process optimization does not inadvertently lead to compliance breaches or ethical compromises. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering regulatory implications would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations that govern API Group's business. Such an approach risks significant penalties, reputational damage, and potential legal action, all of which undermine the company's sustainability and stakeholder trust. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thoroughness would also be professionally unacceptable. This haste can lead to overlooked compliance gaps or the introduction of new risks that were not adequately assessed. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the professional responsibility to ensure that operational changes are both efficient and compliant. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should include identifying all relevant regulatory requirements, assessing the potential impact of proposed process changes on compliance, and engaging relevant stakeholders, including legal and compliance departments, throughout the redesign process. Prioritizing a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape and API Group's ethical commitments is paramount before implementing any process optimization initiatives. Question 12. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a new, innovative service offering for API Group could significantly increase revenue. However, the regulatory landscape for this specific type of service is complex and has seen recent changes. Which of the following approaches best reflects sound professional judgment and regulatory compliance for API Group? Option A. Proceed with the service launch immediately, assuming existing compliance protocols are sufficient, and address any regulatory issues that arise post-launch. Option B. Launch the service with a limited pilot program to gauge client interest, deferring a full regulatory assessment until the service proves profitable. Option C. Conduct a thorough and proactive regulatory review, engaging legal and compliance experts to identify all applicable laws, potential risks, and necessary controls before launching the service. Option D. Rely on industry best practices from similar companies in other jurisdictions to guide the regulatory approach, as direct guidance for this specific service in the current jurisdiction is unclear. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the service launch immediately, assuming existing compliance protocols are sufficient, and address any regulatory issues that arise post-launch. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group is considering a new service offering that, while potentially profitable, carries significant regulatory and ethical considerations. The decision requires a careful balancing of financial opportunity against the duty to comply with all applicable laws and maintain the integrity of the financial services provided. The challenge lies in identifying and prioritizing regulatory compliance and client protection over immediate financial gains, especially when the regulatory landscape is complex or evolving. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the regulatory implications before committing to the new service. This means proactively identifying all relevant laws, regulations, and industry guidelines that would govern such an offering. It requires consulting with legal and compliance departments to understand potential risks, reporting obligations, and necessary controls. This proactive stance ensures that API Group operates within legal boundaries, protects its clients from potential harm, and avoids costly penalties or reputational damage. This aligns with the fundamental ethical duty of care and the regulatory requirement for all financial institutions to conduct business in a manner that upholds market integrity and client interests. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the new service without a comprehensive regulatory review. This could manifest as prioritizing the potential revenue without adequately understanding or mitigating the associated compliance risks. Such an approach would be a direct violation of regulatory frameworks that mandate due diligence and risk management for new products and services. It could also lead to ethical breaches by exposing clients to services that may not be fully compliant or adequately risk-assessed, thereby failing the duty of care owed to them. Another incorrect approach might involve a superficial review, assuming existing compliance measures are sufficient without specific analysis for the new offering. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to appreciate the unique regulatory nuances that a new service might introduce, potentially leading to unintended noncompliance. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying all potential stakeholders and their interests. This is followed by a comprehensive risk assessment, including regulatory, legal, operational, and reputational risks. Crucially, this assessment must be informed by a deep understanding of the specific regulatory environment applicable to API Group. The framework should then involve exploring various options, evaluating them against established compliance standards and ethical principles, and selecting the option that best balances business objectives with regulatory adherence and client protection. Regular review and adaptation of this framework are essential to navigate the dynamic regulatory landscape. Question 13. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent pattern of minor deviations in the reporting of operational metrics for API Group service delivery teams. These deviations, while not currently triggering any immediate regulatory red flags, are becoming more frequent. Considering the company's strategic objective to optimize operational efficiency, which of the following actions best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive review of the reporting procedures and underlying data collection methods to identify the root cause of the deviations and implement corrective actions to ensure accuracy and compliance. Option B. Defer any action until a significant deviation occurs that triggers an explicit regulatory warning to avoid unnecessary disruption to current operational workflows. Option C. Instruct the service delivery teams to adjust their reporting to align with the observed pattern, thereby reducing the appearance of deviations and streamlining the reporting process. Option D. Focus solely on the cost-saving aspects of process optimization, assuming the minor deviations are an acceptable trade-off for increased efficiency and reduced reporting overhead. Correct answer is A. Initiate a comprehensive review of the reporting procedures and underlying data collection methods to identify the root cause of the deviations and implement corrective actions to ensure accuracy and compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group's commitment to process optimization, while beneficial for efficiency and profitability, must be balanced against its regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities. The core tension lies in identifying and implementing improvements without compromising compliance or stakeholder trust. Careful judgment is required to discern between genuine optimization and actions that could inadvertently lead to regulatory breaches or ethical lapses. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the monitoring system's output to identify deviations from established operational procedures and regulatory requirements. This approach is professionally sound because it directly addresses potential noncompliance by proactively seeking out and rectifying issues. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial reporting or operational safety, mandate adherence to prescribed standards. By focusing on deviations from these standards, API Group demonstrates a commitment to compliance, which is a fundamental ethical and legal obligation. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of penalties, reputational damage, and harm to stakeholders. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss minor deviations as insignificant without further investigation. This is professionally unacceptable because even seemingly small discrepancies can indicate underlying systemic problems or potential breaches of regulations. For instance, a minor deviation in a financial reporting process could, if unchecked, lead to material misstatements, violating accounting standards and potentially securities laws. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize cost savings from process changes over the thoroughness of the monitoring and reporting. This is ethically flawed as it suggests a willingness to cut corners on compliance and oversight for financial gain, which can lead to significant regulatory penalties and a loss of public trust. A third incorrect approach would be to implement changes based solely on anecdotal evidence, without validating them against the monitoring system's data and established procedures. This lacks the rigor required for effective process optimization and risks introducing new inefficiencies or compliance issues, violating principles of due diligence and responsible management. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the relevant regulatory landscape and API Group's internal policies. They should then utilize data from monitoring systems to identify trends and anomalies. Any identified deviations should be investigated thoroughly to determine their root cause and potential impact. Solutions should be developed and implemented with a clear understanding of their implications for compliance, efficiency, and ethical conduct. Continuous evaluation and feedback loops are crucial to ensure that optimization efforts are sustainable and aligned with regulatory and ethical standards. Question 14. The monitoring system demonstrates that a newly optimized process for handling customer inquiries at API Group has significantly reduced response times. However, a review of the process documentation reveals that the optimization involved consolidating customer data points without explicitly re-verifying consent protocols for all data types against current data protection regulations. Which of the following approaches best ensures API Group's continued compliance and ethical operations? Option A. Implement the optimized process with a disclaimer to customers that their data may be handled in new ways, without specific verification of regulatory adherence for each data point. Option B. Immediately implement the optimized process across all customer service channels to capitalize on the efficiency gains and address any potential data privacy concerns if they arise later. Option C. Halt the full implementation of the optimized process and conduct a thorough review to ensure all data handling practices within the new workflow explicitly comply with current data protection regulations and consent requirements. Option D. Proceed with the optimized process, assuming that existing general consent forms cover the consolidated data points, and rely on the legal department to review the process retrospectively. The correct answer is B. Immediately implement the optimized process across all customer service channels to capitalize on the efficiency gains, and address any potential data privacy concerns if they arise later. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group's commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct is being tested by a potential oversight in their process optimization efforts. The difficulty lies in balancing the drive for efficiency with the absolute necessity of adhering to all applicable regulations, ensuring that no shortcuts are taken that could lead to non-compliance or reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to identify and rectify any process that, while seemingly efficient, inadvertently creates a compliance risk. The correct approach involves a thorough review and validation of the optimized process against all relevant regulatory requirements before full implementation. This ensures that efficiency gains do not come at the expense of legal or ethical standards. Specifically, this approach prioritizes a proactive risk assessment, confirming that the streamlined process for handling customer inquiries at API Group aligns with data privacy regulations, consumer protection laws, and any industry-specific compliance mandates. This aligns with the fundamental ethical obligation of professionals to act with integrity and to uphold the law in all business dealings, preventing potential fines, legal challenges, and loss of customer trust. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the optimized process without independent verification of its regulatory compliance. This could manifest as assuming that the optimization inherently satisfies all legal requirements, or by relying solely on internal assurances without external validation. Such an approach fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of regulations and the potential for unintended consequences of process changes. It represents a significant ethical failure by prioritizing speed or cost savings over due diligence and legal adherence, potentially exposing API Group to regulatory penalties and reputational harm. Another incorrect approach would be to implement the optimized process and then address any compliance issues that arise reactively. This demonstrates a lack of foresight and a disregard for the principle of proactive compliance, which is a cornerstone of responsible business practice. It places the company in a defensive posture, increasing the likelihood of significant negative repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the objective, process optimization. This is immediately followed by a critical assessment of potential risks, particularly regulatory and ethical ones. The next step involves researching and understanding all applicable regulations and guidelines relevant to the process being optimized. Then, proposed changes should be evaluated against these requirements, seeking expert advice if necessary. Finally, a robust validation and testing phase, including confirmation of regulatory alignment, must be completed before full deployment. This systematic approach ensures that efficiency and compliance are integrated, not treated as competing priorities. Question 15. Strategic planning requires API Group to assess its upcoming quarterly earnings report. Management is aware of several internal operational challenges that will likely negatively impact profitability for the quarter. However, they are also confident that these challenges are temporary and that the company's long-term outlook remains strong. In preparing the earnings release and subsequent investor call, what is the most appropriate approach for API Group to communicate this information? Option A. Focus exclusively on the positive aspects of the business and the strong long-term outlook, deferring any discussion of the operational challenges to a later date when they have been fully resolved. Option B. Emphasize the company's long-term strengths and positive future outlook, while briefly mentioning the operational challenges as minor, temporary setbacks without providing specific details. Option C. Provide a balanced disclosure that clearly outlines the operational challenges, explains their temporary nature and expected impact on the current quarter's results, and reiterates the company's strong long-term prospects. Option D. Release preliminary positive earnings figures that reflect the company's historical performance and address the operational challenges only if directly questioned by analysts during the investor call. The correct answer is B. Emphasize the company's long-term strengths and positive future outlook, while briefly mentioning the operational challenges as minor, temporary setbacks without providing specific details. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group, as a publicly traded entity, operates under stringent regulatory oversight, particularly concerning financial reporting and investor communications. The pressure to meet market expectations while adhering to disclosure requirements necessitates a delicate balance. Misrepresenting or selectively disclosing information can lead to severe consequences, including regulatory sanctions, loss of investor confidence, and damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all communications are accurate, complete, and timely, as mandated by securities laws and ethical professional standards. The correct approach involves a transparent and comprehensive disclosure of the factors impacting API Group's performance, even if those factors are negative. This aligns with the principles of fair disclosure and investor protection, which are cornerstones of securities regulation. By providing a balanced view, API Group upholds its duty to inform the market accurately, thereby preventing misleading impressions and potential insider trading. This proactive and honest communication strategy is ethically sound and legally defensible, fostering trust with stakeholders. An incorrect approach would be to focus solely on positive aspects and downplay or omit negative developments. This constitutes a failure to provide a true and fair view, violating the spirit and letter of regulations that demand full and fair disclosure. Such selective disclosure can mislead investors into making decisions based on incomplete information, creating an uneven playing field, and potentially leading to accusations of market manipulation or fraud. Another incorrect approach would be to delay disclosure of negative information until it becomes unavoidable. This can be interpreted as an attempt to artificially inflate the stock price or avoid immediate market reaction, which is a breach of timely disclosure obligations. Regulatory bodies expect prompt communication of material non-public information that could influence an investor's decision. A third incorrect approach would be to communicate vague or misleading statements that obscure the true financial situation. This lack of clarity can be as damaging as outright misrepresentation, as it prevents investors from making informed judgments. Professionalism demands clarity and specificity when communicating material information. The professional reasoning process for such situation should involve a thorough assessment of all material information, both positive and negative. Before any public communication, a cross-functional team, including legal, finance, and investor relations, should review the information for accuracy and completeness. The primary consideration should always be adherence to regulatory disclosure requirements and ethical obligations to provide a true and fair view to all stakeholders. When in doubt, erring on the side of greater transparency and seeking legal counsel is the prudent course of action. Question 16. Benchmark analysis indicates that API Group's current risk assessment procedures for new project acquisitions may not be sufficiently comprehensive. Considering the U.S. regulatory framework, which of the following approaches best addresses this identified gap while adhering to best practices in risk management? Option A. Conduct a post-acquisition review of any issues that arise to inform future risk assessment processes, rather than proactively assessing risks before acquisition. Option B. Rely on the experience of senior management to identify key risks based on their historical involvement in similar acquisitions, without formal documentation. Option C. Implement a standardized, documented risk assessment framework that requires cross-functional team input for each acquisition, focusing on identifying potential financial, operational, and compliance risks, and establishing mitigation strategies. Option D. Prioritize rapid due diligence to expedite the acquisition process, with risk assessment being a secondary consideration, addressed only if significant red flags emerge. The correct answer is C. Implement a standardized, documented risk assessment framework that requires cross-functional team input for each acquisition, focusing on identifying potential financial, operational, and compliance risks, and establishing mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group is operating in a complex regulatory environment where the interpretation and application of risk assessment principles are critical for compliance and ethical conduct. The challenge lies in balancing the need for robust risk identification with the practicalities of implementation and the potential for subjective bias. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen approach is not only effective in identifying potential risks, but also aligns with the specific regulatory framework governing API Group's operations, which for this assessment is assumed to be the U.S. regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented process that integrates risk assessment into the operational decision-making framework of API Group. This approach is right because it ensures that potential risks are identified, analyzed, and mitigated in a structured manner, thereby fostering a culture of proactive risk management. Specifically, it aligns with U.S. regulatory expectations that require entities to establish and maintain effective internal controls and risk management systems. This systematic approach helps prevent regulatory breaches, financial losses, and reputational damage by addressing issues before they escalate. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or past experiences without formal documentation or a structured framework is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of objectivity and a potential for overlooking emerging or subtle risks that have not been previously encountered. Such an approach may also violate U.S. regulations that mandate documented risk assessment procedures and evidence of their implementation. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed and efficiency over thoroughness in risk identification is also professionally flawed. While efficiency is important, it should not come at the expense of comprehensive risk assessment. This can lead to significant risks being missed, potentially resulting in non-compliance with U.S. laws and regulations, and exposing API Group to unforeseen liabilities. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework, a commitment to a structured and documented risk assessment methodology, and the active involvement of relevant stakeholders. Professionals should prioritize a risk-based approach that is proportionate to the nature and complexity of API Group's operations, ensuring that resources are allocated effectively to manage the most significant risks. Continuous review and adaptation of the risk assessment process are also crucial to maintain its effectiveness in a dynamic environment. Question 17. Governance review demonstrates that API Group's internal audit team is tasked with assessing the effectiveness of the company's policies and procedures for handling material non-public information, MNPI. The audit team has identified potential weaknesses in the current framework. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional auditing standards and ethical conduct for API Group's internal audit function in this scenario? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive review of API Group's MNPI policies, interview relevant personnel, test the design and operational effectiveness of internal controls, and document all findings and recommendations. Option B. Rely solely on management's assurances regarding the adequacy of MNPI handling procedures without independent verification. Option C. Immediately report the potential weaknesses to the relevant external regulatory bodies without conducting a full internal investigation. Option D. Disclose the preliminary findings of potential weaknesses to all API Group employees to raise general awareness. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive review of API Group's MNPI policies, interview relevant personnel, test the design and operational effectiveness of internal controls, and document all findings and recommendations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group's internal audit function is tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of its compliance program, specifically concerning the handling of material non-public information, MNPI. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough investigation and evidence gathering with the potential for inadvertently disclosing sensitive information or creating new risks during the audit process itself. The internal auditor must exercise discretion and adhere strictly to established audit protocols and ethical guidelines to maintain the integrity of both the audit and API Group's confidential information. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented review of API Group's existing policies and procedures related to MNPI, followed by targeted testing of controls. This includes interviewing key personnel, examining relevant documentation, and assessing the effectiveness of training programs. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the audit objective by evaluating the design and operational effectiveness of the compliance framework. It aligns with professional auditing standards, which mandate a risk-based approach to audits and require sufficient appropriate audit evidence to support conclusions. Furthermore, it upholds ethical principles by ensuring that the audit is conducted with due professional care and objectivity, minimizing any potential for unauthorized disclosure of MNPI. An incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate concerns to external regulators without first conducting a thorough internal investigation. This fails to provide API Group with the opportunity to identify and rectify potential deficiencies internally, potentially damaging the company's reputation and incurring unnecessary regulatory scrutiny. It also bypasses the established internal audit process, undermining its purpose and the auditor's role. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review, relying solely on management's assertions without independent verification. This would not provide sufficient audit evidence to form a reliable opinion on the effectiveness of the MNPI controls. It would also fail to identify any potential gaps or weaknesses in the program, leaving API Group exposed to compliance risks. A third incorrect approach would be to share audit findings with employees not directly involved in the compliance program or audit process. This constitutes a breach of confidentiality and could lead to the inadvertent disclosure of MNPI, creating further compliance issues and potentially violating data privacy regulations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a clear understanding of the audit objectives and scope. Professionals should then identify relevant internal policies, external regulations, and ethical standards. A risk assessment should guide the audit methodology, ensuring that testing is focused on areas of highest risk. Throughout the process, maintaining confidentiality, objectivity, and due professional care is paramount. Documenting all steps taken and findings is essential for accountability and future reference. Question 18. Governance review demonstrates a potential conflict of interest involving a senior executive at API Group. The review suggests the executive may be benefiting personally from a supplier relationship that API Group also utilizes. What is the most appropriate initial step for API Group's compliance department to take? Option A. Advise the senior executive to cease all dealings with the supplier until further notice. Option B. Initiate an independent, fact-based investigation into the alleged conflict of interest. Option C. Immediately confront the senior executive with the preliminary findings of the governance review. Option D. Defer action on the governance review findings, assuming the issue may resolve itself over time. The correct answer is B. Initiate an independent, fact-based investigation into the alleged conflict of interest. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group's internal governance review has identified a potential conflict of interest involving a senior executive. The challenge lies in balancing the need to address the conflict promptly and effectively with the executive's position and potential impact on business operations. It requires careful judgment to ensure compliance with regulatory expectations and ethical standards without causing undue disruption or appearing to retaliate. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation led by an independent party, such as the compliance department or external counsel, to gather all relevant facts. This approach is right because it adheres to the principles of fairness and due process, ensuring that decisions are based on evidence. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing corporate conduct and disclosure, often mandate robust internal controls and conflict of interest policies. An independent investigation upholds these requirements by providing an unbiased assessment, which is crucial for maintaining stakeholder trust and avoiding regulatory sanctions. It also allows for the implementation of appropriate remedial actions based on factual findings, aligning with API Group's commitment to ethical business practices. Incorrect approaches analysis, an approach that involves immediately confronting the executive without a formal investigation, risks prejudging the situation and could lead to an unfair outcome. This fails to meet regulatory expectations for a structured and evidence-based approach to conflict resolution. It also bypasses established internal control procedures, potentially creating legal liabilities for API Group. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the findings of the governance review, hoping the issue resolves itself. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of commitment to corporate governance and compliance, exposing API Group to severe penalties, reputational damage, and a loss of investor confidence. Such inaction directly contravenes the proactive risk management expected by regulators. Finally, an approach that involves a superficial review conducted by individuals with close ties to the executive would lack the necessary independence and objectivity. This would undermine the integrity of the investigation and fail to satisfy regulatory requirements for a credible conflict of interest assessment. It could also lead to the concealment of serious issues, further exacerbating the risks for API Group. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should first consult API Group's internal policies on conflicts of interest and corporate governance. They should then engage the appropriate internal function, such as the compliance or legal department, to initiate a formal, independent investigation. The process should be documented meticulously, ensuring all findings are factual and decisions are made in accordance with regulatory requirements and ethical principles. Transparency with relevant stakeholders, where appropriate and legally permissible, is also a key consideration. Question 19. Governance review demonstrates that API Group's proposed new marketing strategy for its specialized services may inadvertently create a conflict with existing data privacy regulations and advertising standards. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation to ensure compliance and ethical conduct? Option A. Prioritize the rapid deployment of the marketing strategy to gain a competitive advantage, deferring any detailed regulatory review until after the campaign has been launched. Option B. Seek to adjust the interpretation of current data privacy regulations and advertising standards to accommodate the marketing strategy's objectives. Option C. Proceed with the marketing strategy as planned, assuming that the new campaign's messaging will be interpreted favorably and that existing data handling practices are sufficient. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment involving legal and compliance teams to identify and mitigate potential regulatory and ethical risks before launching the marketing campaign. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment involving legal and compliance teams to identify and mitigate potential regulatory and ethical risks before launching the marketing campaign. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because API Group's internal governance review has identified a potential conflict between its established policies and the practical implementation of its new marketing strategy. The challenge lies in balancing the need for effective marketing to achieve business objectives with the imperative to adhere strictly to regulatory frameworks and ethical standards, particularly concerning the accurate representation of services and client data. A failure to navigate this conflict appropriately could lead to regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical considerations. This approach is correct because it proactively identifies potential risks associated with the marketing strategy before its full implementation. By engaging legal and compliance teams, API Group ensures that the marketing materials and data handling practices align with all applicable laws and industry guidelines. This demonstrates a commitment to responsible business conduct and mitigates the likelihood of future enforcement actions or reputational harm. The regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principle of operating within the bounds of the law and upholding ethical marketing practices, which are often codified in regulations governing advertising, data privacy, and consumer protection. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the speed of market entry without adequate regulatory scrutiny would be professionally unacceptable. This failure would disregard the potential for misrepresentation or privacy violations, directly contravening regulations that mandate truthful advertising and data protection. Another incorrect approach, which involves proceeding with the marketing strategy based on assumptions about compliance, is also flawed. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an abdication of responsibility to verify adherence to legal and ethical standards, potentially leading to unintentional breaches. Finally, an approach that seeks to bypass or reinterpret regulations to fit the marketing strategy's objectives is fundamentally unethical and illegal, exposing API Group to severe penalties and undermining its integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape relevant to API Group's operations and marketing activities. This involves identifying all applicable laws, regulations, and industry best practices. The next step is to assess the proposed marketing strategy against these requirements, identifying any potential areas of conflict or noncompliance. This assessment should involve cross-functional collaboration, bringing together marketing, legal, and compliance departments. If risks are identified, the strategy should be revised to ensure full compliance and ethical alignment before implementation. This iterative process of assessment, revision, and verification is crucial for maintaining a robust governance framework and ensuring responsible business practices. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that API Group is experiencing a period of significant operational challenges that are likely to impact its upcoming quarterly earnings. A senior executive is considering how to communicate this information to the market. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and stakeholder interests for API Group? Option A. Focus the public communication solely on positive operational developments and omit any mention of the current challenges to avoid alarming investors. Option B. Issue a press release that acknowledges the challenges and provides a realistic outlook on the potential impact on earnings, while also highlighting ongoing mitigation efforts. Option C. Delay the announcement of the challenges until after the earnings report is released, hoping that positive operational improvements in the interim might offset some of the negative impact. Option D. Provide a vague statement about unforeseen market conditions, without detailing the specific operational issues that are affecting API Group's performance. The correct answer is B. Issue a press release that acknowledges the challenges and provides a realistic outlook on the potential impact on earnings, while also highlighting ongoing mitigation efforts. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because API Group, as a publicly traded entity, operates under stringent regulatory scrutiny. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for transparent and accurate financial reporting with the potential for market manipulation or insider trading. Stakeholders, including investors, regulators, and the public, rely on the integrity of API Group's disclosures. Misrepresenting information, even with the intent to manage short-term perceptions, can lead to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and a loss of investor confidence. The correct approach involves prioritizing full and fair disclosure of material information, adhering strictly to the reporting requirements of the relevant regulatory bodies. This means ensuring that any public statements or disclosures are accurate, complete, and not misleading. This aligns with the fundamental principles of securities regulation, which aim to protect investors and maintain fair and orderly markets. Specifically, Regulations like those enforced by the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, in the U.S. mandate that companies disclose all material information that could influence an investor's decision. Ethical considerations also demand honesty and transparency in all dealings. An incorrect approach would be to selectively disclose information or to frame information in a way that creates a misleading positive impression, even if technically true. This could involve downplaying negative developments or exaggerating positive ones without providing the full context. Such actions can be construed as market manipulation or a violation of disclosure rules, leading to investigations, fines, and potential legal action against API Group and its officers. Another incorrect approach would be to delay the release of negative material information in hopes of a more favorable market environment. This violates the principle of timely disclosure and can be seen as an attempt to deceive investors. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant stakeholders and their interests. Next, they must thoroughly understand the applicable regulatory framework and ethical codes. When faced with a situation involving potential disclosure, the primary consideration should always be the accurate and complete representation of material facts. If there is any doubt about the materiality or potential for misinterpretation, seeking legal and compliance counsel is paramount. The decision should be guided by the principle of investor protection and market integrity, rather than short-term financial or reputational gains.